All right. So first, thank you can you all hear? Great. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I usually, when I'm giving a CRISPR talk, I talk about CRISPR ethics generally or public engagement, but other people are taking care of those. So I'm going to talk about something that I've been thinking about in other contexts. So I work across multiple technologies. I'm a human geneticist by training, but I work on emerging tech generally. And I sort of think of each new technology as an opportunity to get innovation right. And the CRISPR has come into the world at sort of a particular moment that has sort of adds to the unique constellation of issues that the technology itself raises. And in my 20 minutes, I want to raise two challenges that I think this sort of historical moment poses for the CRISPR community, and that I think can be addressed in, as I was saying, an opportunity to get innovation right. Oh, there we go. So the two challenges I want to talk about are balkanization between fields or applications and balkanization between publics. And I'm also going to talk about solidarity, which is sort of an emerging theme in bioethics that I think is emerging also as a consequence of these different kinds of balkanization that we're seeing. It has many, many definitions. The two sort of main ones come out of the Christian tradition of solidarity and charity and labor union solidarity. But I'm going to use just a more general definition of sort of the recognition of shared vulnerabilities in a context of what is admitted or arguably structural injustice. Another important piece of this is sort of what we all take ourselves to be doing, right? Science generally. These are the missions of NIH and NSF and also Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions, which I assume has a mission quite similar to other academic medical centers, right? To enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, to improve the health of the community and the world. This shared goal focused on improving human well-being. And health, of course, is critical to human well-being, but well-being is more broad than that. So taking the balkanization, the solidarity, and our mission of improving human well-being, I'll go to my first kind of challenge that I think the CRISPR community will be facing. And it begins with a struggle that academia has had for centuries, right? The siloing of academic disciplines and how isolated we are all from each other. And you can see this even here at this meeting, right? This is a really unusual meeting already. This is not the usual cast of characters. This is not the group of folks I have heard speak many, many times, because we're all usually in our own little boxes. And that's really useful in the sense that it allows specialization and real depth of knowledge and progress in individual fields. And bioethics is just as siloed as the science, by the way. So I mentioned I work across multiple different technologies. The people who work on genetics and ethics don't have much overlap with the people who work on stem cells and ethics, that don't have much overlap with the people who work on neuroscience and ethics or synthetic biology and ethics. We're all in our own little boxes. Again, depth of knowledge, but it has limitations as well. There are also silos in terms of context. Right? The research context is quite different to the clinical context, the commercial context, public health, and law enforcement, all of which, in genetics in particular, have sort of a way that they do genetics, for example. Right? And there's an important rationale for this siloing as well, because there are different motivations for the genetics activities in these different contexts, and there are different norms around and governance models around the genetics activities in these contexts. So for example, law enforcement justification for tissue sampling is very, very different than research or clinical justification for tissue sampling. And then there are also silos in terms of context, governance here in the US versus governance in other nations. And as I mentioned, when walls stand, you can have specialization and depth of knowledge, but you also have this lack of crosstalk. And for example, the neuroethics people don't know that we've already figured this issue out over here in genetics. And wouldn't it be useful to look at that literature? And as I mentioned, also different motivations and different governance models. But the challenge is that these walls are now falling, which can be really productive. So for an example, in the learning healthcare system, we have spent decades building up a wall between research and clinical space. And this produces generalizable knowledge, and this treats individual patients. Genomics is an obligate learning health system. You are constantly learning from every genome that you sequence, so you can't be neatly in either of those spaces. It's a really productive breaking down of silos in some ways, but it's causing lots of challenges because informed consent. And how do we look at lots of people's data so that we can learn what is working without the informed consent that we are used to in the research context. You can violate expectations of what should happen when the silos start breaking down. So how many people, well, we're in California, Golden State Killer. Who's familiar with who knows what I mean when I say Golden State Killer? So this was a case where a publicly available website, GEDmatch, where you can take your direct-to-consumer genetic test results, upload them and look for relatives, et cetera. Law enforcement used that database to find relatives to a sample from a series of cold cases from decades ago. And by looking at those genomes and then doing some ancestry work, found a suspect and who is very likely the Golden State Killer. So that happened in the summer of 2018. Hundreds of cases have since been solved that way. But again, the governance around collection of tissue samples and DNA in the law enforcement context is quite different than in the direct-to-consumer genetic testing context or in a publicly available website where people have gone to look for relatives. That's a case where the breaking down of silos is potentially very problematic, right? The people who uploaded their sequence there were not expecting that law enforcement was going to be using that database for their own purposes. Gamete donation is another one, right? It's the introduction of direct-to-consumer genetic testing generally has opened up or created permeable membranes between previously distinct silos. So in the context of sperm donation for reproductive purposes, men who donated 20 years ago expecting anonymity are now being contacted by the children that resulted from those donations. Even if they haven't participated in the direct-to-consumer genetic testing databases where folks are finding each other, if their sister did, game's over. Anonymity is gone. So again, that kind of breaking down of silos, maybe in some cases that's very productive. There was a very interesting episode of Modern Love in which a man met his donor children. They all got together. He hit it off with one of the moms, and now they're together. So it could be productive, but it's also causing a lot of upheaval in families as well. And in the CRISPR context, right, the DIY bio, the do-it-yourself biology community, right, people who are injecting themselves with CRISPR, that has potentially an impact on the research field generally, even though that is not part of the research silo. So this, I think, one of the challenges that CRISPR is going to face, obviously genetics generally is facing lots of this sort of permeable membranes between previously discrete silos. I expect that CRISPR is going to face similar sorts of challenges. So things to think about in this regard, I think we need to conduct research on ethics issues, understand what kinds of ethical issues are going to emerge when silos like this dissolve and merge. We need to think about ways to organize science that is more flexible, and think about new models for governance that don't silo technologies or applications off from each other in ways that make the governance incompatible with across silos. And that one example of this, just last week they had the NEXT RAC, which is the RAC, the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee that came out of the Asilomar Conference, has been re-envisioned as the Novel and Exceptional Technology and Research Advisory Committee that is going to try to look at technologies across silos as opposed to in discrete, looking at just discrete silos one at a time. The second challenge of this historical moment that I want to raise is the balkanization between publics, and we've heard a little bit about this already. We are in a moment of tremendous income inequality, right? This here is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality in OECD countries. The darker the color, the more income inequality there is. And here in the US, this is from the 2018 World Inequality Report, you see the share of national income held by the top 1% versus the bottom 50% of the US. So we are living in a time of tremendous income inequality that's been accelerating over time. And there is, I think, increasing recognition that this income inequality and the entangled inequalities that come with it must be attended to. And of course, CRISPR did not cause this, right? CRISPR had nothing to do with this. And I'm not suggesting that it did, but it is the context in which CRISPR finds itself. And we have given the mission that we have of improving human well-being. I do think it is something that we need to attend to. But this inequality leads to a lack of social cohesion. I think it's part of what has dramatically increased the number of calls for public engagement, which we have heard about and we will hear more about, right? A call for public engagement has become the more research is needed of a consensus document. It's there for all recent consensus documents. But many publics don't have any reasonable expectation of benefit. Right, certainly given the slide that I just showed you, many people will not have financial access. We heard this morning about the cost of CAR T therapies, gene therapy for SMA, beta thalassemia, also the mutation-targeted therapies for cystic fibrosis. Hugely expensive medicines to which people will not have access. And beyond financial access issues, there's also issues of biological access, right? We have a problem in genetics in particular that over 80% of the sequences in GWAS studies that we have done are on people of European descent. We are the least genetically diverse people on the planet. So there is a huge amount of genetic diversity that we simply don't have access to, that is going to limit who has access to biologically driven therapies. And this issue has made it into the CRISPR conversation, right? This is the Nuffield report from last year on CRISPR. They started with 2 principles that must be met prior to the use of this technology. And the second principle here, the use of gametes or embryos that have been subject to genome editing procedures or that are derived from cells that have been subject should be permitted only in circumstances in which it cannot reasonably be expected to produce or exacerbate social division or the unmitigated marginalization of, or disadvantage of groups within society. I've never seen that in a report of this sort. This was really impressive. It's also an incredibly heavy lift, right? An incredibly heavy lift. In particular here in the US. They have a better shot at it in the UK with the NHS. But in the US, it's unlikely to happen. And over the last 15 years or so, when I've raised an issue like this with the scientific community in various venues, I mean, what I hear is it's not my problem to solve. Which I get, like, we can't solve it. The CRISPR community cannot solve this problem. But we could consider not making it worse and thinking seriously about ways to not make it worse. And while I'm, in the interest of time, I'm only providing sort of the most sketchy of arguments for this claim, there is much more nuanced argumentation available, including in the Nuffield report, including a book by Faden and Powers from 2008 and a whole series of articles as well, where they state, as I have, that public health and science policy are justified by the role of health in human well-being, and state that it has both that science and science policy, public health, should have both the positive aim of improvement of human well-being, which was in every single one of those mission statements that I showed you, but also the negative aim of preventing or combating patterns of systematic disadvantage. Right? This is just one framing, but I do think it's something, again, that we are faced with in this moment, and a challenge that the CRISPR community should take up. I think that we should take seriously this claim that if our goal and justification of the work we're doing is improvement of human well-being, that radical inequality is, in fact, our concern. I do not know what the answer is, but I do think that we need to figure out what a response looks like at each stage of the research, right? It's often easier to engineer in access earlier rather than later once you've developed a boutique, high, medically intensive intervention. We need to diversify, right? There's a phrase in media that news is what happens to editors, right? The editor has a heart attack, suddenly there are stories about cardiovascular disease. Well, in academia, research is what happens to PIs, right? And if the PIs are only a small section, a small subset of the human population, we're not asking all the right questions. And we aren't representing all of the values. And, of course, we need to do public engagement, but I'm going to leave that to others to take up. Thank you very much.